What we know behaviourism to relate to is a set of assumptions about the nature of knowledge, the way we understand things. Now, all of you would have heard of the Pavlov's dogs. It's based very much on a physiological stimulus-response model. And what it assumes is that if you give the right stimulus, you will get the required response. And that the response is objective and measurable. You can see it, you can measure it, it's objective. So the way that we see the sort of behaviourist models manifest is often in the sort of drill and practice approach. So if I do A, you'll do B. And in terms of the sort of assumptions that underpin much of the training that is in the vocational education system, there's a very strong lean to a behaviourist approach. And the way that's represented is in the way that training packages or curriculum try to objectify outcomes, break outcomes into very small components, and assume that if you can put all those small components together, you can actually do the whole job. And a lot of the training that is associated with that is the sort of in the nature of sort of drill and practice. The outcomes are standardised, the outcomes are measurable, and the outcomes are observable. I mean, most of us, when we learn to drive a car, what we do is we learn through behaviourist principles. And we learn the mechanics of driving a car through those sorts of approaches. And behaviourism got huge currency in the 1940s. Partly, it would seem, because of the huge success of this training approach in training up large numbers of people during the war years. So what cognitivists were interested in were the sorts of ways in which the brain managed information, got information together, created ideas. Where the cognitives probably have been important, at least in vocational education, is in the notion of instructional design. Because the vocational system has been very strong over the years in terms of producing modules. And the cognitivists have been very influential in the instructional design approaches that underpin those modules. And so in the modules you see things like advanced organising. So at the beginning of the module it'll tell you what's covered in the module, what order it's covered in. So this sets up the process for someone who's going to learn. So if they've got a notion of the whole thing, then they can often fit the other bits in more easily than if you roll out all the little bits and then say, oh well, this all sort of goes together. If you look at also the instructional design approach, often there's a short section and then there's some review questions. Simply comes from the notion people learn better in short segments, where there's reinforcement at the end of it. And so you see these modules where there'll be something written and then the students ask 2 or 3 questions. So the cognitivists have been very influential in that way. What they gave to learning theory is an understanding of the way in which the brain operates in terms of what we understand to be learning. Now the humanists are much more concerned with people's development. So the humanist approach is very much concerned with people being the best people they can, the notion of self-actualisation. It's much more concerned about the person than the content. It's not about what they can do or what they can learn. It's about self-development. The practical part of it is to say, well, look, how do these things manifest in the way that we go about our work? The behaviourist stuff manifests when we're trying to teach routine, mostly mechanical, but things that you're doing. The notion of cognitivism is really useful when you're actually designing learning materials, because it tells us about the ways in which people learn and the sort of strategies that improve learning or inhibit learning. How is the humanist approach useful to us? Well, I think most people here would acknowledge that unless you actually value the other person in some way and that they're getting something out of it from a personal development point of view, for many of our learners things aren't going to work really well. Now, constructivists then came along and said, well look, it's all right that you cognitivists acknowledge that something actually happens in the brain, but what you're actually also assuming is that in some way that people's previous experiences in the world don't influence the way they derive meaning from what they're doing. So constructivists are about meaning. It's not about how the brain has learned. It's not whether you can do something in terms of stimulus response. It's about, well, what do I understand this means? Now, people often have great trouble sort of coming to term with this sort of notion of constructivism, but I think it's fair to say that out of a group of 40 or whatever people are here today, whilst it might be not true to say that there are going to be 40 different versions of what actually happened today going out of the door, As a group, you'll go out with different understandings of what today means. And there'll be some commonalities and there'll be some differences. It depends whether you've ever done any educational studies before, what your vocational background is, what your cultural background is, whether you've had a lot of teaching experience before or none at all, and so on and so forth. But those sort of factors all influence the way you derive meaning, not whether you can repeat in a rote learn form, but how you derive meaning from it. Now, is constructivist learning theory really useful if you are trying to teach someone the procedures for threading a sewing machine? And what you want them to do is thread the thread through a series of holes and create loops and all of that sort of stuff. And you want them to do it exactly the same way every time in a standardised procedure. Is that consistent with a constructivist view? No, it's not. But if you send some sewing machines to a country that has never seen modern sewing machines, where there's been, let's say that there's been civil war or some major environmental catastrophe or something like that, trying to get to the question of what can these machines do for us, then that's pretty consistent with a constructivist view of the world. The assumption is that people derive meaning based on their own personal histories and culture and background. Now, the social constructivists came along because they said, well, look, that's all very nice, but all the behaviourists, the cognitivists and the humanists and the constructivists seem to think that people are individuals. You don't take into account that people actually live as in groups. And so whilst we agree largely with what the constructivists are saying, that what's important is the deriving meaning, where we disagree is that where the constructivists' assumption is that it's about the individual, the social constructivists would assume that it's about the group. Now, there are individuals within the group and they would acknowledge that. But importantly, what the social constructivists will assume is that the cultural background of the group, the history of the group, will influence the way in which the group as an entity learns. The best examples really are indigenous communities, whether it's Maori or whether it's Aboriginal or whether it's Inuit. They tend to have a very strong group culture, a very strong notion of what may, for example, constitutes family or what constitutes land or what constitutes ownership and so on and so forth, which is very, very often different from the way that Westerners understand it. Now, that particular socio-cultural bath is historically derived over generation and generation and generation. And what the social constructivists say is it is that socio-cultural environment in which people live which is really important in terms of deriving the way that the group derives meaning from learning and the individuals within the group. So it's not just about me, it's about us. And in fact, it goes two ways. The idea is that the socio-cultural environment in which you find yourself influences the way you construct meaning, number one. And the second part of the equation is the way that you derive meaning also affects the socio-cultural environment. So it's a two-way street, not one way. Now, the critical emancipatory people basically says, well, this is all very nice, but really what education should be about is empowerment. It should be about people understanding the power dynamics that influence their lives. And the whole purpose of a critical emancipatory approach to education is to unpack or reveal the power dynamics that suppress particular groups within our community, with the specific intent that those people will be able to take actions which will liberate them from suppression or oppression. An example of something like that would be in South Africa, before the end of apartheid, in the black communities there were English language classes going on. The purpose of that was partly to learn English, but the real purpose was about emancipation. It tends to be most obvious in countries where you've got these strong divides between rich and poor, between haves and have-nots, and are-ables and aren't able. The author that everyone talks about in regard to Freire, F-R-I-E-R-E, who worked in South America and was very influential in pushing the idea of education